In this episode of Frank Weber's Party, the second episode that we've done, I'm going to tell you a little story from fairly distant past, from high school government class, and relate it to some of my ideas and content for my show. And then we're going to get into reviewing Priscilla Barnes' very first TV appearance, maybe acting gig. I'm not 100% sure on that, but it's an episode from Columbo in 1975, and I think you're really going to enjoy it, so stay tuned and sit back and relax and have a good time. Welcome once again to Frank Weber's Party. I'm so glad that you could be with us today. You make it all worthwhile. I'm your host, Frank Weber, and today I have a little story to tell you that was actually way back when I was in high school, but it kind of relates to this show. I'm trying to make sure that some of these stories early on kind of relate to what I'm doing here, and then we'll get into a review of one of the episodes of Columbo, the one Priscilla Barnes debuted in. And so, I just wanted to start with this story. When I was a senior in high school, we took high school government class in Texas, and we had a great teacher in Miss Craig, and she made it really fun for us, and we had a project where we pretended to be a Texas legislator, and we were going to write some bills and pretend to get the bills through the House and the Senate so that they could be signed by the governor and whatnot. And so the first one that I did was a proposal to make fireworks sales year-round in Texas. They're only allowed a total during the year of like 20-some-odd days, about half of them at New Year's and half of them at 4th of July. And the law, as it stands right now, has a lot to do with probably property protection, most likely, and not causing wildfires. But since we've had a lot of rain these last couple of weeks, we're probably not going to have a wildfire problem for 4th of July this year, thank goodness. But I like to blow things up as a kid and do fireworks, and Grandma would say, "Oh, little boys are going to pee in their pants." And anyway, so I wrote this proposal, and apparently some kid in class just pigeonholed it, basically just put it in his desk so that it never saw the light of day, never had a debate or a vote on it. And it was like this little turd, this little asshole kept me from doing that and always kind of pissed me off. But anyway, we had the opportunity to write a second bill a short time later, and this one was a little unusual because we were seniors in high school, right, and we were about to get out of there and go to college or whatever we were planning on doing after graduation. And I wrote a bill where basically I said there had been a problem for a few years in Texas public schools because the start date of school had gotten earlier and earlier and earlier, and in the 80s it had been around September 1st. And this was now 1995. Our senior year, I think we started August 14th, which was ridiculously early. And I think in sixth grade, it had been August 28th. And it just got earlier and earlier and earlier. And I'm like, what the hell is going on here? Why is it getting so early like this? And I decided to put a bill and say, hey, the legislature can tell these school districts that they can't start before a certain date, right? And they seemed to have some other agenda, whether it was year-round school or whatever. I don't know. But I tried, and I got up in front of the class and tried to present the bill. And one of the ways that the kids had been, or my classmates had been, I don't want to say brainwashed, but they had been kind of convinced that this was a good idea, is because when school started that early, apparently they could have their fall semester finals before the Christmas break, which is a good perk, I admit. But the kids that had come before us, and even us in earlier years, didn't have that privilege, and it worked out fine. So anyway, I think the bill came up for a vote, and it was defeated by my classmates, and I was disappointed in that. I probably should have sold those bills a lot better. The point of the story here, though, is that the real state legislature a few years later passed something similar that they said it couldn't start before a certain date. It wasn't September 1st as I had proposed. It was a little bit earlier. But they passed that concept for real a few years later, and the governor signed it, and I find an interesting connection to that. My idea was really good, or ultimately it was good. And anyway, since then, they have exceptions to the rule now. Apparently, school districts can get out of it if they consider themselves special or something like that. But anyway, the point is, as I'm writing this show and show prepping and trying to make some good, interesting content for you, I hope that you like my ideas. They might seem a little outlandish or far-fetched, or you might wonder why I value doing a certain thing so much like that. I think that they're good, they're entertaining, and I think you'll enjoy them, and I certainly appreciate whatever feedback you can give me. Obviously, I put my email and my Twitter in particular at the end of the show notes so that you can give feedback. It's obviously a work in progress, but we're getting there, and I'm glad that you're a part of this, and hope that you're telling your family and friends and hitting subscribe. Let's take a real short break, and then we'll get into our review of Columbo episode from 1975. So we'll be right back. All right, so we're going to review an episode of Columbo today that Priscilla Barnes, I believe, made her debut in 1975. Her first TV role, maybe her first acting role. Peter Falk apparently was one of the people that discovered her and gave her 3 lines in the show. And when we do this, we're going to not necessarily do them all in order. We'll just probably go back and forth, but nothing in chronological order is what I'm trying to say. We'll analyze this show. I really enjoyed this show. I had never really been much of a Columbo fan, but it really is well put together and has a different concept to it. So, without further ado, we're looking at Columbo, Season 4, Episode 6, called A Deadly State of Mind, and it aired on April 26, 1975. The overview and history of the show: you had pilots in 1968 and 1971. I believe those were both on NBC. And then you had a run on NBC from 1971 to 78, and then ABC a little bit further down the road from 1989 to 2003. And the show was unusual because it wasn't a weekly, hour-long episodic show. It was more of a feature length, meaning an hour and a half to 2 hours. And it was irregular in its showing. They were, at its peak, it was probably doing about 5 to 6 episodes a year. Lieutenant Columbo was the detective's name of the LAPD, homicide detective, so most of the shows were about murder. And Columbo had a few trademarks. He wore a worn beige raincoat, usually had fairly disheveled hair, but pretty laid back, kind of easygoing, usually chomped cigars, drove a Peugeot, which is, of course, a French car, an old one, too, by the way. He loved chili con carne. He usually mentioned an unseen wife, but she was unseen, so she was never really in the show. And then he always came back to ask witnesses or potential suspects one more thing. He said, one more thing, and then I'll leave you alone, that sort of thing. These little traits, anyway, the bad guys would look at him and think that he's really no big deal. There's no way this guy is going to solve the case. And so they took him pretty lightly. He wasn't bumbling in the sense of, say, an Inspector Clouseau, like Peter Sellers did in the Pink Panther movies, where the bad guys probably felt the same way about him, but he was definitely, did not give the appearance that he was going to solve the case and bring it to justice, in other words. And then the other thing about this show is really kind of a backwards detective story, very unusual, where the audience knows early on who did it. That is out there pretty early. And then Columbo has to go through and collect the evidence and ask questions and gather all this data, and really goes out of his way to deduce things in order to get to who did it. And that was one of the most amazing, interesting parts of how this show came down. This particular episode, we'll go ahead and talk about main characters. Obviously, Peter Falk played Columbo. Like I said, he helped Priscilla Barnes get into acting. She has 3 lines in this show, but is uncredited. So if you look up her filmography on something like Wikipedia, it probably won't be on there. He's been in a lot of things, a number of them actually as a detective. Some credits include This Is a Mad, 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 Mad World, which is a pretty funny movie. I recommend it if you got 3 hours or so. Very long for a comedy. He's also in The Great Race, Murder by Death, which is another wonderful movie, kind of like Clue. That was also came out in the 70s. Well, no, Clue was in the 80s, but Murder by Death came out not too long after this episode. And I would definitely recommend it because Peter Sellers and Alec Guinness and some other people are in it. He was also in The Cheap Detective, The Princess Bride, of course. And then he was actually in a movie again with Priscilla near the end of his career. His final film role was in American Cowslip, and I think he passed away about 2 years after that. Let's go into some guest stars here. The 2 main guest stars and recognizable names here. You got George Hamilton playing Dr. Collier. He's known for his suntan and his debonair appearance. My brother Tom and I know him most from an early 80s movie, 81 I think it was, called Zorro the Gay Blade. And of course he in the episode is Zorro, and he romances Lauren Hutton, and Zorro happens to have a twin brother who happens to be gay, and Zorro manages to get some kind of injury and is out from being able to fight the bad guys, and so his gay twin comes in and steps in for him and wears all these colorful outfits. It's definitely worth a look. I consider it a great comedic cinematic masterpiece, and George Hamilton could definitely do some comedy. And he was in a movie a little bit before that, Love at First Bite, which was a Dracula type of movie, but a comedy. And then later was in things like Godfather Part 3, I believe the last of the Godfather films, and then I don't remember this for some reason, but apparently he was in the movie Doc Hollywood with Michael J. Fox, a movie I remember more for Julie Warner coming out of the lake, if you ever seen that movie. But anyway, also interesting about him is that he had an unusual repeat appearance as a different character on Columbo in 1991. Different character, but also played a murderer. And then the other person that I recognize and have seen in a few films in this movie is Leslie Ann Warren, who plays Mrs. Donner. She really started as a Broadway actress, but she was in a lot of TV and movies, such as Victor, Victoria, and Clue, which we just briefly mentioned there. Worth Winning, which was a Mark Harmon movie. I know her, and I think my brother Tom, we're both in a lot of comedy. We both know her from Life Stinks, which was a Mel Brooks movie from 1991. It wasn't his funniest movie, but it was okay. And then not too long after that, she was in Pure Country with George Strait, where he, of course, played a country singer that was kind of wanting to be a little bit low-key. Her work that I have seen makes me think that she would, I'm sure she's a really great person in real life and has been in some other roles, of course, but she makes me think that she would be a great nagging wife or boss. She just seems to have a certain look and demeanor to her in that regard. But I'm quite certain she also has some more range. Let's go ahead and get into the plot. There's other people in the movie. I kind of vaguely remember them, maybe in some other things. I don't remember exactly what, but they certainly weren't first bill here. But essentially what's going on is that Dr. Collier, played by George Hamilton, is having an affair with his patient, which is Mrs. Donner. That's played by Leslie Ann Warren. They've apparently been at this affair for 7 months. Dr. Collier is a psychiatrist and a researcher in behavior who apparently has been taking meds like barbiturates and other things that are not really used for sedation or hypnosis or anything anymore. He's been taking the meds from his lab and research building to hypnotize her. And they're doing therapy sessions as well. They're also having an affair. He apparently is writing a book in addition to the research with mice. Mrs. Donner is also part of his research and therefore the book. Apparently, the research is not really going well, and we see his publisher come in a time or two in the movie. I suppose he has a book deadline or a manuscript deadline. And Mr. Donner apparently knows of the affair, and they're at a beach house that Mr. Donner owns, and Dr. Collier shows up there one night, and Mrs. Donner is there too. And a confrontation happens, and Dr. Collier winds up killing Mr. Donner with a fire poker. And then Dr. Collier and Mrs. Donner's a little shaken, didn't want to see her husband die, but she also gets value out of this affair. They then make up a story about what they're going to tell the police regarding how this happened. They always want to cover for Dr. Collier, but they basically said 2 burglars came in and wanted jewelry and etc. and made off with some of the jewelry after killing Mr. Donner, but they wind up hiding the jewelry themselves. And then Collier winds up leaving. He almost hits a blind man walking his dog when he leaves the beach house. And he hits a lamppost, actually, with what he does. And then he goes back to his lab. Dr. Collier appears to be having an affair with his research partner, Dr. Borden, as well. And then Columbo, our hero, comes in and he collects evidence, asks questions, basically does all of his amazing work. One of the things about this show, just as an aside, not just this episode, but the other episodes as well, is that while he doesn't have the appearance of somebody who could do anything, the bad guys never really threaten him or mistreat Columbo or anything like that. And I think that's another important point there. But there's obviously a number of different scenes, and which I'll get into some of those here. But later on, I don't want to tell you everything because I'm hoping that you'll go out and watch it for your own there. But Mrs. Donner later falls to her death trying to dive into a pool about 5 stories below. And that happened because Dr. Collier hypnotized her in order to prevent her from doing a lie detector test, as Columbo is telling Dr. Collier that, her stories don't add up because he's figuring everything out. Eventually, Collier is found guilty when he admits, or not in court, of course, but he later admits that the man he saw was blind in the very last scene, kind of a sleight of hand scene, because the blind man had a twin brother who was not blind, and Columbo used the brother that was not blind to go ahead and read and stuff, and then apparently got it out of Collier that, the man I saw was blind, and then the blind man comes out, and then Collier's guilty. The only issue that really didn't have closure at the end, and Dr. Collier and Columbo were talking about this. Columbo suspected the death of Mrs. Donner was a murder and not a suicide, and apparently that was not figured out at the end, but maybe it was after all that took place and they had a trial and all that. Just wanted to go over some scenes after that. There was an interesting scene. A guy on a YouTube put a video out here pointing this out because I didn't notice this when I first watched it, but apparently Willie is the name of a mouse in Dr. Borden's lab, and Dr. Collier's publisher comes by his building one time to visit and whatnot and talk about the book, I'm sure. And he's talking to Dr. Borden, and she's telling him, we're just checking about the mice have to go through these mazes in order to get the food and and all that stuff. And she tells him that his name is Willie. And then the publisher says, for some reason, I don't have a Willie. And obviously Willie, of course, is slang for, apparently the guy has no dick, if you really want to bring it to that conclusion. But that was pretty funny. I appreciate that YouTube poster who put that out there. Another thing that I've noticed, there's a ton of smoking in this episode, and that was common in earlier days of TV. We don't see that much anymore because smoking has been so vilified. Of course, Columbo has his cigars and chomps cigars, but Dr. Collier, interestingly, who's an MD, as a psychiatrist, medical doctor, carries a bunch of cigarettes in a brass or possibly gold-plated case. There are some other people, as I recall, smoking during the film, but it was really interesting to see that, since we just don't see that much anymore. We'll talk about the Priscilla's scene. So anyway, Priscilla Barnes' scene, she's playing a nurse, and she has, actually, I counted 3 lines as the nurse, which perhaps foreshadows her role as Nurse Terry Alden on Three's Company. And basically what happens is she's really just giving Columbo directions in a building that is a maze, which is not unusual for 70s design and architecture. And it was really interesting because in the scene right before this, Columbo is talking to the receptionist, and she says, "Oh yes, Dr. Collier, he's in the East Wing, just follow the blue line." Because this building has a bunch of lines, multicolored lines on the floor. And it was not unusual in that day, as I said, for buildings to be designed in sort of a maze form, and that you needed to have extra directions in order to get around. I believe the dental school in San Antonio, the UT dental school there, or at least the old building, which I'm not sure they use anymore, was very much a maze, but they didn't have the multicolored lines on the floor. So the receptionist said, "We'll just follow the blue line," and then Columbo gets in there and asks directions of this unnamed nurse played by Priscilla, and I think he even asked, "Do I just follow one of these lines or whatever," even though he was already told it was the blue line. So I wasn't sure what was going on there exactly, but it was a nice little debut for Priscilla, and good to get out there, get started in her long career. Well, the 2 other scenes, I kind of told you a little bit about the ending and the blind men, or the one blind man and his not blind brother. But we also see there was an unusual party scene in this show where at the same time Mrs. Donner was falling to her death, Columbo was going over there to talk to Dr. Collier primarily. I don't recall if he knew that Dr. Collier was going to be at Dr. Borden's place. But anyway, Dr. Borden is hosting this cocktail party, and there's a lot of guests there. And it gets really interesting because I believe Dr. Collier introduces Columbo to all the guests, and then they take a real interest in his detective work and this particular case. It was really interesting. They ask Columbo about the case, and he divulges a lot of information about the evidence that he's gathered so far, and he's conversing with them about this case in a friendly manner. And of course, the odd thing is that Dr. Collier is right there. He's the main suspect. And you'd kind of think that this would violate some sort of rule, I would think, in detective work or police work. As far as confidentiality goes, of course, in dentistry, we have tons of confidentiality rules and such. So I thought that was really unusual, and you just have to see it. I mean, you'll know what I mean by it, really. And then, of course, we already mentioned the scene where everything was wrapped up at the end, sort of a sleight of hand, where, you see a guy who looks like the blind man, but is actually a twin brother who can read. And Columbo, and actually Dr. Collier has the guy read a few lines. And then Dr. Collier says basically, well, the guy I saw was blind, and then the blind man comes out, and basically Dr. Collier has then incriminated himself. So it was really an interesting way they put that all together at the end. Like I said, the only thing lacking is we didn't really find out if they really proved the murder of Mrs. Donner on there. But overall, it was a really good show. I understand why that was so popular for so long. I think that's about it here. As a detective show and investigation and all that, it was very suspenseful, even though we already knew who committed the crime. So, I give the overall show an A. I give Priscilla an A for her debut. Was really intrigued by this. Just to give you a little forethought, in the next show, we're going to review an episode of hers on the old Robert Urich Vegas detective show, and I came out of watching both of these shows thinking that Columbo was light years ahead of Vegas in terms of its content and suspense and just overall content. So that's about all that I have for today. I know it's another fairly short episode. I think we're going to be less than half an hour on it. Obviously, I'm looking forward to hearing from you, taking your feedback and your reviews, like I said, either through Twitter or Facebook or my email address, how we can continue to make this show better. Still trying to get some interviews lined up. That may take a few shows still. And anyway, just hope you're enjoying the party here. We're still trying to jazz it up, but I'm glad that you're tuning in and enjoying everything. And if you like it, certainly hit subscribe, tell your family, and tell your friends. Anyway, until next time, this is your party host, Frank Weber, signing off from Frank Weber's Party. The theme song is called Retro Funk by Soul Prod Music and can be found at pixabay.com.